None of the billions that were being offered were going to the WTA. Companies weren't just chasing Alex Eala. They were skipping the whole tour. A 19-year-old Filipino had surpassed a professional circuit built over 50 years in terms of financial utility. The tennis world didn't just raise eyebrows when the financial numbers began to surface. Instead, it held its breath because what was happening wasn't a sponsoring tale but rather a power shift, a modest corporate revolution disguised in a tennis skirt, and the WTA didn't notice it coming. Stay locked in because, in the end, you'll understand why the most important struggle in women's tennis right now isn't happening on any court. A particular kind of athlete transcends its sport before it appropriately recognizes them. It was Muhammad Ali. It was Serena Williams. And now, Alexandra Eala is doing it on a scale that includes business boardrooms from Manila to Manhattan, completely reworking their marketing strategy, whether or not the WTA institution approves. Eala brought something to professional tennis that no coaching manual teaches. She was born in the Philippines, brought up under strict discipline, and trained at the Rafael Nadal Academy in Mallorca. Her story resonated with billions of people in Southeast Asia, Europe, and the Americas at the same time. It was a true cross-continental, multi-generational story. What marketing executives covertly refer to as a great cultural convergence was produced by this combination: the underdog location, the elite European training ground, and the contagious personality. Long before the rankings caught up, businesses took note. Eala's social media following had surpassed that of many players with higher rankings by the time she was making waves on the WTA tour. She had higher than average Instagram interaction rates for a tennis player. They were powerful enough for any athlete, anywhere in the world, in any sport. Companies are gauging genuine audience engagement by real emotional commitment from authentic communities, rather than just follower counts. We are looking at statistics that prompted their analysts to verify the information twice. Sports companies, high-end watch manufacturers, tech giants, and telecom companies with sizable Southeast Asian customer bases. They were actively competing rather than just being interested. Discussions were progressing from exploratory discussions to significant financial pledges behind closed doors. Notably, these conversations were not taking place via WTA partnering channels. They were heading straight for Eala's attorney. This distinction is quite significant. The WTA operates using a traditional sports marketing framework. Income models built around the community, official tour alliances, and centralized sponsorships. Although it was designed for a different era, the model worked well for decades. Before, a single athlete can attract more online interest than the entire company's promotion of her. Eala stood for everything that the previous model had failed to take into consideration. A player whose unique brand gravity was completely removing sponsors from the tour's orbit. Just by appearing and engaging with people on a frequency that WTA's institutional voice was unable to match, not by disagreement or conflict. There were more and more murmurs in tennis circles. Brand partners began informing agents representing other players that budget allocations were being examined. Rejuvenation recommendations started to get more subdued responses from tournament sponsors. Women's tennis wasn't losing money. It was concentrating on a single, distinct point of cultural gravity. There was a name for that point. There was a backhand to that point that might disrupt conversations. And that was only the beginning. Pose this question to yourself. When was the last time a teenager forced billion-dollar companies to completely reconsider their approach to sports marketing? Because it was already there at that point. There is a technique for numbers to get out of rooms. They were never meant to leave. The figures pertaining to Alex Eala's individual sponsorship portfolio that were being discussed in private conversations weren't minor endorsement agreements. Professional tennis players outside of the top 10 typically get mid-tier settings like this. A player who is still rising in the rankings, was placed in commercial negotiations typically reserved for veteran Grand Slam champions due to a type of financial commitment that was revealed in secret term sheets in preliminary agreements. According to reports from the sports industry, each brand delivers comparable figures that, when combined throughout numerous partnerships, created a total portfolio value estimated in billions rather than millions when projected over multi-year commitments. According to reports, one of the top contenders was a telecom giant with significant market penetration in Southeast Asia. Numerous sportswear companies entered crucial discussions by interpreting the cultural imprint AIA controlled throughout a sizable and growing customer population. She was considered indispensable by tech companies looking for genuine ambassador voices in emerging areas. These offers were unique not just because of their size but also because of their structure. Brands weren't contacting Eala's management to see about how she fit into the current frameworks for WTA neighboring partnerships. They were building entirely custom setups, creative collaborations, ownership stakes, sponsored content initiatives, and long-term ambassador infrastructures that viewed her as more than just an athletic endorser. In an interview with industry publications, a sports marketing analyst characterized the situation with startling candor. Brands had made the fundamental decision that going around the tour rather than through it was a more effective way to access the emotional connection Eala created with the audience. Although useful for reaching big tennis audiences, the WTA's official partnership infrastructure was unable to provide the precise, intensely devoted, culturally unique groups that personally followed Eala. This information had serious financial ramifications for the WTA. The collective loses power when businesses shift sponsorship funds from organizational alliances to individual athlete agreements outside of tour facilities. Visibility is lost for other players. Financial streams are lost in smaller competitions. The burden is felt by the entire ecosystem. This is the aspect that actually made the tension more intense. This situation wasn't created by Eala. She wasn't positioning herself as an enemy of any organization. Her representation was only providing appropriate commercial response to extraordinary market demand. Strategy. That isn't a revolt. That's business. However, the WTA penalties were the same for all purposes. Tour execs were having heated conversations behind closed doors. When one of its own members is now a more desirable individual investment than the group platform, how can an organization maintain sponsorship significance? In order to accommodate an athlete whose personal audience outweighs institutional reach, how might commercial frameworks designed for a pre-social media context be reorganized? These were no longer speculative strategic inquiries. They needed answers very away. And the WTA seems to be looking for the answers far too slowly for reasons that will eventually become very public. Whether Eala deserved these offers wasn't the big question. No one really questioned that. Much more unsettling was the question that was tearing through tennis boardrooms. Had the commercial story already been lost by the WTA? If so, would they ever be able to get it back? When there is a systemic catastrophe, silence is never really quiet. Everything is communicated and indicated. The WTA's official communication channels were noticeably quiet as brand discussions surrounding Eala were getting more intense and sports business media was starting to make official connections. There was only institutional inaction at the exact moment when bold action was most needed. No formal acknowledgement, no strategic positioning statement, and no clear attempt to reframe the commercial conversation on their terms. And it was horrible to be silent. In today's media landscape, an organization's failure to control its own narrative creates more than just a void. It gives everyone else the microphone. Fan communities across continents, rival sports organizations, tennis writers, and sports marketing analysts all scrambled to fill the interpretive gap left by the WTA. The story being told without them was unflattering. It showed a governing body caught completely off guard by a change that, looking back, had been observed for years. This delayed reaction had complex underlying structural factors. Working across multiple jurisdictions, the WTA concurrently balances conflicting interests from players, competitions, broadcasters, and well-known business partners. Under normal circumstances, decision-making within that framework proceeds deliberately because deliberateness exhibits responsibility governance. However, the circumstances surrounding Eala's commercial boom were anything but typical. Speed was necessary, adaptation was crucial, and speed wasn't coming. Meanwhile, individual sponsors, growing wary of the WTA's strategic orientation, started probing talks that months earlier would have been unthinkable. Brands that had maintained stable, mutually beneficial tour partnerships after years were suddenly asking basic questions about return on investment. Were WTA-adjacent positions still reaching the audiences brands needed most? Or had those viewers moved away from institutional channels entirely in pursuit of particular athletes, singular experiences, or distinct cultural moments? Tour leadership was really unhappy with the internal responses those brands were getting. Digital analytics are not negotiable. The overwhelming finding of numerous independent commercial studies was consistent, and audience movement data disregards historical relationships. The WTA's ability to reach some valuable audience groups has significantly declined. Even though Eala's many platforms had concurrently today, players began to notice the downstream effects across the tour. Discussions with potential personal sponsors were poignant. WTA alliance alignment was no longer mentioned as a positive indication by brand representatives, or they were framing it with qualifications that had never been used before. The institutional support that previously increased the commercial value of individual players was beginning to lose some of its allure. Speaking anonymously to sports media, seasoned athletes conveyed sincere annoyance. They had dedicated their lives to enhancing the WTA's overall business standing. Many saw institutional quiet at a critical juncture as a serious leadership failure that may destroy years of teamwork. Officially, nothing has changed. The WTA's lack of communication wasn't just a PR blunder. It served as a warning to all of the corporate partners who are presently assessing their involvement with women's tennis that the organization lacked the awareness or the resolve to manage its own change. That signal held significant weight for sponsors used to working with forward-thinking, strategically articulate firms. There was a genuine cost associated with each day of institutional stillness, and the bill was mounting quickly. Corporations never use the word withdrawal when they start discreetly reorganizing their financial obligations. It's always softer. Changing investment priorities, portfolio reevaluation, and strategic reallocation. However, the meaning remains the same beneath the meticulous corporate jargon. The funds are flowing. Additionally, it began to move with frightening speed in women's tennis. The departures didn't make a big announcement. Institutional sponsorship erosion never works like that. It occurs as a result of unresolved renewal discussions, option clauses that expire without being activated, and partnership agreements that are merely not renewed with the zeal or at the amounts of money they once demanded. The commercial foundation started to reveal fractures gradually and then all of a sudden. A number of well-known WTA businesses started shifting significant amounts of their sports marketing funds to individual athlete collaborations outside of tour arrangements. The tournament ecology sensed this right away. Smaller WTA tournaments, which rely heavily on sponsorship revenue compared to broadcast income, started operating under tighter financial constraints. The calculation behind these decisions was simple and, from a purely commercial perspective, entirely rational audience engagement metrics around specific players, Eala being the most dramatic example, but not the only one, consistently outperformed tour ride placement data for brands optimizing every marketing dollar against measurable audience response. Discussions about prize funds get exceedingly complicated. The sportsmen who would never command individual billion-dollar portfolios but who built the competitive backbone that made top tennis possible, the organizational infrastructure supporting hundreds of players throughout the professional circuit, began to face real strain. Seldom did this aspect of the repercussions receive much media attention. Eala's remarkable commercial rise was the main subject of the lead storyline. Her gravitational commercial power was hurting the athletes who would never directly benefit from it, according to the more subdued yet important narrative. Eala's sponsorship talks do not benefit a mid-ranked player competing in the second division of WTA tournaments. However, if those discussions divert funds from the public infrastructure supporting her work, she loses everything. In the tennis world, a number of prominent voices started speaking out about this issue. Eala wasn't the target of an antagonistic exchange. Almost everyone agreed that the situation wasn't her fault or her creation. The organizational leadership's perceived lack of adaptability and structural flaws in the sports advertisement architecture were the main sources of discontent. When assessing the scenario, sports economists noticed a troubling similarity with processes that had already caused other professional sports leagues to become unstable. Revenue distribution within the sport becomes fundamentally unbalanced when individual athlete commercial worth significantly exceeds institutional brand equity. The athletes who have large individual profiles are quite valuable. Economic uncertainty is growing for everyone else. Financial instability occurs in the midst of the competitive field, which is vital for the long-term viability of any sport. The WTA needed quick, astute institutional innovation to manage this dynamic. The company needed business models that could recognize and support outstanding individual athlete value while maintaining substantial joint revenue sources. The sponsorship exodus was loudly responding to the question of whether such capacity existed within the current leadership. Eala was never really the focus of the corporate exodus. They served as a judgment on whether the WTA had changed quickly enough to be commercially vital in the face of a shifting media landscape. And at this particular time, the conclusion was obvious and stark. The court's decision has been made. Now, everyone was focused on a single interview, and nobody could have foreseen what happened next. Sometimes an athlete will say something in athletics that is so accurate and unexpectedly honest that it cuts through the institutional narrative and instantly becomes public knowledge, much like a spectacular winner down the road. That moment was provided by Alex Eala. Not only did the internet react, but it exploded. According to an interview, it spread quickly through several sources. Eala's directness in addressing the business situation around her career surprised almost everyone who saw it. She wasn't hostile. She wasn't handling manufacturing disputes or grievances. Her remarks somehow hurt more than any emotional outburst could have because of the way her tone was composed, measured, and careful. She talked about representing something greater than personal success, about realizing that her presence carried responsibility to the Filipino, Southeast Asian, and young women around the world who saw themselves reflected on her trip regarding exploring commercial potential in ways that acknowledged that duty, and about asserting that her value, her true cultural currency, deserved recognition on conditions that truly mirrored reality. Then she muttered something cold that put an end to the entire chat. She admitted that the system surrounding professional women's tennis had not been designed with athletes like her in mind, but she did so without resentment. Athletes whose cross-cultural resonance, rather than their ranking success, was the primary source of their commercial fame. Athletes who, regardless of institutional frameworks, have audience interactions. Athletes who challenged preconceived notions about how value is determined and allocated in professional sports simply by virtue of their existence. At the same time, such words spread everywhere. Within hours, they were highlighted by sports media. Publications in the marketing sector looked into them with genuine interest. Southeast Asian fan communities erupted in passionate gratitude and ferocious pride. Millions of interactions occurred on all major platforms as tennis fans across the world engaged in intense debates about institutional responsibility, commercial equity, and structural justice. The confrontational nature of the encounter was not what made it so potent. It was the profound rationality of what Eala was saying. Her viewpoint could not be seen as naive or self-serving by anyone listening. Her structural observations were accurate, confirmed, and represented concerns that athletes, analysts, and sports economics had been discussing in private for years. It was incredible to hear a 19-year-old in the middle of the storm describe them with such subdued precision. As usual, the WTA took a long time to respond to this interview. Eventually, formal comments emerged, but they came out as defensive rather than thoughtful. A truly self-assured company would have addressed Eala's opinions with intellectual seriousness instead of institutional deflection, according to measured observers. The public sympathy for her was only heightened by the contrast between her composure and the organization's peculiar location. Direction. The event was transformed into a cultural landmark by social media fan communities, particularly in the Philippines and throughout Southeast Asia. Hundreds of millions of people saw the interview's clips. For several days in a row, the hashtags surrounding her name dominated popular conversations on numerous platforms. Suddenly, prominent feature articles about women's tennis were appearing in international media outlets that rarely covered the sport. And while the business and institutional world swirled around her, IA stayed calm, polite, and focused on tennis. Perhaps more than any one message, her poise revealed something profound about her personality and increased her appeal to the businesses who are pursuing her with significant financial investment. Every conversation about women's tennis was now dominated by one question. Did something change permanently, or was this a transient turbulence? Alex Eala did not start a dispute with the WTA. She simply became too big for the current structure to accommodate. Brands followed real value, viewers followed genuine connection, and an institution founded for a bygone era found itself economically surpassed by a teenager bearing the sporting aspirations of an entire nation. The figures are accurate. Emotion is not negotiated by the departing sponsors. Here, a profound change occurred. Additionally, women's tennis will never look the same. The biggest chapters in women's tennis are currently being written, so if this story truly touched you, hit the subscribe button to make sure you don't miss a word.